We were told that Ekurhuleni Metro policeman had died under very suspicious circumstances. And we were told to dig. And what we found has been mind-blowing. Sebastian Groenewald emerged as a key figure in a violent gang in Reiger Park who used a stolen police rifle to avenge the death of his brother. All the avenues to the story, they're just never ending. And it bleeds directly into the criminal underworld. And what's key and what stands out for me is that perfect example of the intersection between police and crime and how the worlds end up merging.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. Last week we spoke about the case of Jacobus Geldenhuys, who was a police officer or a man within the police field who turned nasty, and how he used his connections within the force to his advantage. But if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it up here for you. It's very weird to have both of my hands free because we're testing a new mic today, so we'll see how this goes. But for today's case, we are going down the same path of the police force or of police officers. And today we're going to talk about the case of Sebastian Groenewald and how these connections in the crime underworld are so linked to our everyday lives within South Africa, and it's actually very scary. But with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today, we are just going to jump straight into the case because what happened caused the disastrous ripple effect that we're going to talk about later on. This case starts with a man named Mark Groenewald, who was the brother of Sebastian Groenewald. On the 8th of December 2017, Mark Groenewald was at a corner store as he was getting a few odds and ends, and he walked outside the shop and was gunned down in broad daylight. It would later emerge that Mark was part of a notorious and violent gang, and at the time that he was gunned down, he was quite a high-profiling member. Mark had also just come out of a lengthy prison sentence for murdering another gang member. And according to some of the reasons that I saw online as to why Mark was actually killed, was because he had just come out of prison and because he was a high-profile gang member at the time, and they didn't like that Mark had just come out of prison and that he went straight back into his high-profile member role at the time. So because Mark just stepped into his old position, the other gang members didn't like this. So what the rival gangs did was they took it upon themselves to act on revenge, and they were now going to take Mark out, which they did. And this all took place in Erica Street at Reiger Park, Gauteng, South Africa. And this moment and this killing was the catalyst for a lot more suffering, specifically in Reiger Park. Now, in order to get into this case, we have to go kind of to the end of the case to understand how it all links together. So Mark Groenewald, like we said, passed away in December of 2017. And then remember I mentioned that he had a brother named Sebastian. Well, Sebastian Groenewald was highly affected by his brother's passing, of course, but Sebastian actually worked as a police officer at the time. He was licensed to carry very heavy weapons, automatic weapons, and he was basically in a SWAT position. So he was like one of the really talented and special forces kind of police officers. So Sebastian was constantly surrounded by violence. He saw violence in his personal life with regards to his brother. He worked in a very violent section of the police force, even though our police force is very violent with the crimes that we have. But he worked in a particularly very violent field, and he's holding on to the trauma about what happened to his brother. So this really affected him. And then in 2020, Sebastian's body was actually found in an open field near Reiger Park. Sebastian's body had been beaten, shot, and just dumped in the field. But according to police evidence, Sebastian had not been killed there. It was just a body dump, and his phone was neatly placed on his chest. Sebastian's body was also placed near a footpath, so whoever put Sebastian's body there knew that he was going to be found and knew that they were going to find him pretty quickly. They also made sure that he was still in his uniform at the time of the shooting. So now, because a police officer had been murdered, police were running full force, had their ears to the ground in order to try and solve this case as quickly as possible. So many police officers were involved to try and solve this case, and when they were doing their investigations, they came across Sebastian's vehicle. Now, this vehicle had been allocated to Sebastian. So in the police force, they get different vehicles, and because Sebastian was in a more specialized unit, he himself was allocated a specific vehicle. And inside this vehicle that the police were looking at, under the seat was a R5 rifle. And the police were looking at this and they thought this was very strange because you're supposed to put all the guns back in the armory, especially of this size. Yes, police are allocated their 9mm that they keep on their hip, but these big guns need to be put back in the armory because it's not every day that the police are required their SWAT team to run around. Maybe not every day. So naturally, because this gun was so out of place, ballistics testing was done on the gun. And because ballistics testing was done on this gun, this would crack the case wide open and open so many channels of confusion and crime that I don't think many other police officers and South Africa was expecting. And sadly, this just reinforced the narrative that in South Africa, crime and policing go hand in hand. So when police are now looking at the serial number on this gun, they're having a good look and they notice that this R5 rifle is actually a stolen weapon from the armory that had been reported stolen months ago. So now the police have a weapon that was listed as stolen underneath Sebastian Groenewald's car seat, who had just been murdered a couple of days before. His cell phone was specifically placed on his chest, and ballistic tests have now come back to prove that this gun specifically had been involved in 6 other murders at least. The victims of these murders were Shiraz Obere, who was murdered on the 18th of September 2019 in Reiger Park, Antonio Plaikes and Antoinette Diaga, who was gunned down in a drive-by shooting on the 12th of December 2019. Antoinette actually wasn't murdered on the 12th of December, however, the wounds that she suffered that day she would later pass on from. Then, on the 1st of January 2020, Michael Mackenzie was also murdered in a drive-by shooting at Vickers Circle.
So we're here in Reiger Park at a place called Vickers Circle, and if you look at the geography of this area, the entire neighborhood is built around this massive traffic circle. Michael Mackenzie, also known as Zeno, was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting. We know from eyewitnesses who were present here on that night that his car had left the road and driven through this patch of grass while he was taking fire, and it stopped here. When police examined the scene, they found cartridge casings littered around this area, and it was very clear that Michael Mackenzie was the target of a well-planned hit.
And then Gordon Peterson was also shot and killed on the 11th of Jan 2020. So all of these murders were all related by this one weapon that was found at the back of Sebastian's vehicle or under his seat. Sebastian's fingerprints were also on this gun, and it was stolen. So the evidence was quite damning that most likely Sebastian did these murders. But of course, they only had Sebastian's body. Right now, that's all police had to go on, but albeit a very strong case against Sebastian. But it gets worse, it gets more hectic from here on. However, when talking about the people we have just spoken about who were gunned down by Sebastian, allegedly, there was also a case of mistaken identity. A man named Shoaib Dowji was killed in his BMW after it was riddled with bullets as he was driving on the M1 near Sandton, and this all took place in March of 2020. But like I said, this was actually a case of mistaken identity, and the person that Sebastian allegedly was trying to kill was actually a man named Mohammed Syed, who was the director of Carney Links Tobacco. So now we are looking at some deep-rooted crime. So now Sebastian has been linked to trying to murder men with millions of rands. These are really high-profile men within their companies. But if we go back to the murder of Shoaib Dowji, the reason why he was actually murdered instead of the actual target, Mohammed Syed, was because he looked incredibly similar to Mohammed, especially in the BMW with sunglasses on. And also both men were very close friends. They both went to the same mosque and they both had the same vehicle at the time. However, we know that working such high profile cases or murders, actually, one cannot necessarily work alone, and Sebastian didn't. Police would later uncover that Sebastian would previously work odd jobs with his brother Mark before he passed away, but he also had another brother named Sean, but Sean would not really be connected to these cases specifically because he was actually in prison for most of these murders and he had spent a long time in prison. However, Sebastian also had another person that he worked with named Jonathan Schoeman, and Jonathan Schoeman was apparently the getaway driver. Now, because police were slowly linking the people who were apparently connected to these murders together, they did question Jonathan Schoeman, and apparently he was very cooperative with police. He would answer all of their questions, and when pressure was starting to be put on Jonathan, he did say to police, okay, I'll tell you what happened. as long as I get an incredibly lenient sentence. And police said, like, yeah, we'll give it to you. There's high profile men trying to be murdered. And also there were 6 other murders at least. We need to try and wrap this up and solve it. We'll basically give you a lenient sentence. But to them, lenient was not no sentence at all. So Jonathan now sits down with police and he tells them exactly what happened. So Jonathan Schoeman basically confessed that Sebastian Groenewald and himself were hitmen for hire. And Sebastian Groenewald was mainly the man who would pull the trigger, and Jonathan was just the getaway driver, as mentioned earlier. Now, as you kept hearing me say earlier, that Sebastian and Jonathan allegedly were targeting high-profile men. Not only had they killed a lot of people within Reiger Park, as we mentioned earlier, but also the attempted hit on Carly Link's director, even though they mistook his identity, and murdered the completely wrong man. However, their target was clear that they needed to murder the director of Carly Link's tobacco. But when talking about high-profile men, Sebastian and Jonathan allegedly also targeted another high-profile tobacco director with Gold Leaf Tobacco, and his name is Simon Rudland. So the attempt on Simon Rudland had taken place in August of 2019, and sadly Simon still has a bullet lodged within his neck. But at the scene, the police found a handgun that was later linked to Jonathan Schoeman, and there were also empty bullet casings from Sebastian Groenewald's gun. Now apparently on that horrific day, witnesses would say that they saw a white vehicle parked outside of the business premises for quite a while, and when they saw Simon Rudland and his lawyer pull into the driveway before they went into the business park, they pulled in and this white vehicle came right behind them and started opening fire, and one of the bullets hit Simon in his neck. Simon, like I said, was struck in the neck and he was put into the ICU for quite a while. Now, what connected Simon and Mohammed Syed was actually that they were both part of FITA, or FITA, which is the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association. And basically everyone who sells tobacco within South Africa need to be a part of this association because it allows for fair trade, it allows for the regulation of tobacco, and also tries to stop the criminality around selling tobacco. But with regards to the case, there seems to be even more. Allegedly, remember, Jonathan Schoeman confessed to this crime, even though he has now recanted his statement or confession to the police. He said that he never said this, he was coerced, and he would never say something like this because he was never involved, allegedly. But one thing that police do remember from his statement is that Jonathan allegedly said that the killings that were done near Reiger Park and Vickers Circle was actually revenge killing based on Mark Groenewald, that Sebastian was getting revenge on these people because they had some kind of link to Mark's death. And another allegation is that apparently the mastermind behind Sebastian and Jonathan's alleged involvement in these murders was a man named Yusuf Kaji. Because when the hits were happening on the tobacco directors, Jonathan and Sebastian were very involved in phoning Yusuf, texting Yusuf, and they were in constant communication with Yusuf at the time the directors were being stalked, shot at, and once they thought that the job has been done. And allegedly, Jonathan had actually texted Yusuf once they had thought that they had killed Mohammed Syed, and Jonathan then texted Yusuf saying that Olympus had fallen. So this is very much an ongoing case, and I think that it will be ongoing for quite a while because there is so much going on with this case. And even though Jonathan has been arrested and Sebastian has been murdered, they are basically only the sprinkles on top of this massive ice cream sundae, and there are so many more layers that need to be scooped out in order to get to the deepest part of the sundae. And I think that because of the high-profile members involved, I think that this case is going to be very nasty and take a very long time, if even anything is done about it. But like I said, Jonathan Schoeman has been arrested, and if charged, he will face a very long time in prison. But this just shows how deeply integrated the crime is in South Africa and how big corporations may or may not be linked to the gangs in South Africa. But that's all from me. Let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope you've all had a great week and have a great weekend further. Thank you for everything, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.